have as our guest David Melton. He is Executive Director of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. He's been spending a good part of the last 2 years. Well, he's been Executive Director of that organization for the last 2 years, so he's been spending most of his life on reforming Illinois government. Before then, he's been very devoted to reform. Previously, he's been practicing law for, what, 3 decades, David?
Yeah,
something like that?
Years.
Intellectual property, but now he's a do-gooder. So what you're going to do in this show, and don't you change that title, don't you change anything, because we're going to start with the grand bargain. We're going to outline for the governor and Speaker Madigan, in terms they will understand, in terms I think what they want, certainly what the public wants, a deal. So we're taping this on August 7th, 2015, and we expect as soon as it airs in a week or two, they will see it and everything will be solved, almost in time for the kids to go back to school, for people to finish their summer vacation, and la-di-da, right, David?
Absolutely, Jeff. I appreciate this effort to move the state forward. I hope we'll be successful.
And as a sidelight, a day or two ago, the governor came out and said, here's what I want, and here's what they should want. So there's sort of another way of looking at the deal. We'll hit that as well. And then make sure you understand what the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform is about, and understand, the chairman of the board, who's former state senator Susan Garrett, a former guest on Public Affairs. And look, if you get that out of the show and you get a few laughs, I think you've gotten your money's worth, right?
Absolutely.
You'll give them a few laughs, right?
I will try my best.
Okay.
Comedy is hard, though.
So the thing of it is, David, the governor has said he had this turnaround agenda, right?
Right.
What's the turnaround agenda mean to you?
Well, the turnaround
I don't want to put you on the spot, but
the turnaround agenda in broadest terms means prior government wasn't getting the job done in fixing the state's problems. Look at the state's problems and come up with a plan, an overall plan for fixing those problems. So in the broadest terms, I think that's what he got elected on. Now, he's interpreted that to mean certain specific things. I'm not sure that majority of the people voting necessarily had all those things in mind when they voted for him, but they wanted to see a change.
Okay, and what are those specific things that he wants to focus on for reform?
Well, if you listen to the governor, I think the things that he says he wants to focus on are
term limits, right? He wants a vote.
Well,
he wants to put on the ballot term limits, and to do that, the General Assembly, controlled by the Democrats, has to vote to put it on the ballot to amend the Constitution to have term limits. Did I get that right?
That's correct. It can be put on the ballot in 2 different ways. One is through the legislature doing it, as you've just mentioned. The second way is through citizens petitioning to put it on the ballot.
500,000 signatures or something like that?
About 400,000.
Okay. And if the legislature votes, is it just a majority vote?
Yes.
In the House and the Senate,
Yes.
Right? But I think he wants the Speaker to commit to call it for a vote. He's not saying put votes on there, as we know the Speaker controls about 10 godzillion votes. Well, there are only 118 state House representatives, and there are 71 Democrats. So the Speaker controls 71 votes in the State House, right?
Well, he's got 71 people in his caucus. I'm not sure he can control 71.
Everybody but Jack Franks and who's the guy, Scott Drury from up north here
Right.
on Highland Park. Everybody else, the Speaker says jump, and they say how high? For the Democrats, right?
Now, expressing my personal opinion, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Okay.
But there is a strong, the leaders, the legislative leaders in Illinois have a lot of power because of the way the campaign finance system works.
Okay, but seriously, folks, so that's what he wants. He wants that to be put on he wants Madigan to say, and Cullerton, the Senate president, who perhaps almost has as much power, but not as much as the Speaker. That would be accurate, right? You know the Democratic Party.
The Speaker has been in office for over 30 years. He's got a long track record and a lot of
So
experience.
has Cullerton. He's been a state senator for,
But he hasn't been in the same
He hasn't been
position of power.
right. He's only been Senate president for,
So
what,
I
5
would
or 6 years or something
Yeah,
like that.
so I would say the Speaker is the more senior member
Okay.
of that
Okay,
role.
so he wants that to be on the ballot, term limits. He wants redistricting, something like a mathematical formula, something that just gets away from gerrymandering. They do this, I think, in California. They do it in Iowa. There are a number of states, right?
It's not-
That's one of your big issues, right? I'm just going to shut up for a few minutes and let Melton tell us about redistricting.
Redistricting 101. Actually, what we're trying to, what the state has been trying to do is reform its redistricting process, which, as you know, and as a lot of people know, is a little bit of an irrational process here. It turns on the equivalent of a flip of a coin, actually drawing one of the two parties' names out of Lincoln's hat, and whoever's name gets drawn ends up with complete control of the redistricting process for the next 10 years.
Wait a second, that's not how it works now, is it?
Yes, that is how it works. If there's an impasse, if it comes to an impasse.
Oh, if there's an impasse, but in
But
the past.
there has been an impasse
since-
every time since, except 1980.
No.
Yes? Well,
Because in 2000, there might have been an impasse in 2001, because at that time, the Republicans had the governor's chair, right, until 2002. And they also had, I guess, the Senate majority.
Well, there's a
But in
redistricting
2002, the Democrats won the governorship, they won the Senate majority, they had the State House majority. So did redistricting occur in 2001 last, or was it 2003? In that cycle, in that 10-year cycle, I can't remember.
Yes, redistricting.
So in 2001, I think
the Democrats won the draw.
they won the draw,
In
because there was an impasse.
In 2000 and
So they
2010.
gerrymandered the hell out of
The
the state.
Republicans won the draw in 1990, and they gerrymandered the hell out of the state.
But they don't know how to do it because it only lasted
Yes,
for
they
2 years.
did. They were quite effective. They controlled the
won for 2
legislature
years.
during several of the years during
No.
the 1990s.
In 1994, there was a revolution across the country, and the Republicans won the State House, but it lasted for 2 years. As people said, Speaker Mike Madigan took a coffee break.
That's
Because 2 years later, the Democrats took control of the State House, and the Speaker became Speaker again, Speaker Mike Madigan. So how can you say they gerrymandered the hell out of it
Because
in
the
the
majority,
90s?
because the majority of the voters in this state tend to lean Democratic, Jeff, so that's called democracy.
So despite the gerrymandering, there is an overwhelming groundswell of Democrats to vote Democrats into a majority of the State House in 1996. That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Are you smiling at me because you have trouble holding a straight face with that?
Absolutely not. If you
Okay.
remember,
Okay.
the Democrats not only won in Illinois, they also won the presidential election that year.
Of course they won it. They were running against Bob Dole, who was, like zero. He was, as the Republicans say, next in line. That was his only qualification. He'd been in, the Senate for so many years by
I
making
disagree
deals.
with you. I
A
think
man
Bob Dole-
completely devoid of philosophy or principles.
I disagree totally with that. Bob Dole was a decorated veteran who served
Yes,
this
he was a
country
patriotic veteran. Doesn't mean
well
he
for
did
many
anything
years.
else. It doesn't have anything to do with his ability to be president, does it? Because you're a decorated veteran, you should make him president?
I'm not saying I voted for him. I'm saying he was a
Okay.
very decent, intelligent,
Sorry, we're
and
getting off.
public-minded man.
My apologies, folks. I've distracted. Digression, as they used to.
And I
yell
find
at me.
it to be myself to be in the unusual position of defending Bob Dole.
Okay, but seriously, we did get distracted on that. In 2001, putting it more neutrally,
Right.
the Republicans won. The Democrats, there was an impasse. The Democrats won the coin toss, so they gerrymandered the hell out of the State House and the State Senate. In 2011, they had the governor's chair, Democrats. They had the State House majority. They had the State Senate majority, so no impasse. They
Correct.
just gerrymandered the hell again out of it.
They controlled the process.
Anything they missed that was too close in 2001, they revised and got it better in 2011,
Under the
right?
current system in Illinois and in many other states, the party that controls the process works it to their maximum benefit.
And, okay, so since you're the expert, what would be your proposal how to change redistricting to make it less partisan for either Democrats or Republicans?
Well, in principle, I think that the proposed amendment that's circulating for petitions now, in general, is a good idea. The devil is in the details, as always. But
What does it do,
it
essentially?
creates essentially an independent commission with non-politicians, for the most part, drawing the lines as part of an independent redistricting commission every 10 years.
And to try to make it really more as reflecting what the neighborhoods are and not like, as they call it, gerrymandered snaking around here and there.
Right.
So things that tend to be a neighborhood tend to be a block, that's the district.
Is
that it in a nutshell? I'm simplifying.
That's it in a nutshell,
Okay.
simplified, yes.
And so presumably out of that, you would have more contested elections, more balance. You still may
There's
get
a debate.
Democrats win or Republicans win, but you'd start with more of a balance in terms of that district reflecting
There's
a,
actually a debate among the academic experts on this as to whether a fairer redistricting system leads to more contested elections or not. We're seeing partly the...
how's it worked in Iowa and in California? I think both those states have something like this.
They have something like this. You've seen a slight increase in competitiveness. You've seen better,
Okay.
I think, a better system for redistricting. Redistricting, though, is an inherently political process.
Okay, so Rauner wants that, I think because he thinks if you get term limits and you get redistricting, you're going to have better government. If you have better government, you have a populace that's happier, and it's more attractive to companies to come in, more to jobs, because they inherently like good government, apparently. The last bit is almost laughable, but I can almost say that. No, seriously, corporations do want to be in a stable business environment, and when you tend to have, as we have in Illinois, a state run by one party, there's less competition and therefore less likely to be less efficient provision of public services.
Well,
Would you go with that? Have I stated that neutrally enough?
No, you have not.
Okay.
It's not a one-party state. As you know, there are large swaths of the state where the Republicans have the advantage. There are more Republican voters than Democratic voters.
Well, you would admit that 71-47, which is the margin of Democrats over Republicans in the State House, and what is it, 39-20 margin of Democrats, 39 Democrats to 20 Republicans in the state Senate, and now you have a Republican governor. Before you had a Democratic governor. With those margins, with a Democratic governor, with the judiciary and the state Supreme Court leaning Democratic, you would admit that you could pretty much call that a Democratic government, even though there are portions of the state where you may have more, geographically more Republicans or more Democrats. Those margins I gave you are pretty astounding.
Compared with Texas or Florida or most states in the Deep South that are Republican states, yes, Illinois is more of a Democratic state, certainly.
Okay. Anyway, so Rauner wants that for some reason.
Well, Rauner wants that for some reason. You've outlined some possible altruistic reasons. It's also possible that the Republicans think that those changes will benefit them.
Of course. I mean, if you have...
They probably will, but not as much, not enough to tip the balance.
I don't want to make those show about that, my fault. So he wants term limits, he wants redistricting, he wants what he calls true workman's comp reform. There was workman's comp reform a few years ago, but it really didn't change the causation issue. What's the causation indeed? Because we've got an expert lawyer here.
Okay. The causation,
three
the
decades of
with,
legal practice, you would know the causation issue.
Well, as you will recall, Jeff, being an equally experienced lawyer, the workman's comp system was set up to try and avoid a lot of the issues and complications that we have in the normal tort system for resolving injury claims. And one of the things that's part of the system is in return for accepting caps on what can be recovered and other restrictions, the employees don't have to prove causation. That was a basic part of the workman's comp system.
But you mean in Illinois?
No, I mean nationally.
But how is it, so Rauner claims, and we've seen Mike Flannery, who's no right-winger, put people on Fox, whatever it's called now, Fox Chicago Sunday, Fox 32, whatever. He had somebody on there who was a local company guy, and he said, look, if I stay here, this is what I have to pay in workman's comp. If I go to Indiana, way less. Almost most other states, they pay way less. So if it's the same elsewhere, why are workman's comp average cost per employee so much lower elsewhere than they are in Illinois?
Well, number one, they're not necessarily so much lower elsewhere, but they are lower in states where essentially there's been a fair amount of union busting and there's been a fair amount of going after the trial lawyers and trying to tilt the system back in the employers.
Could it be that it actually is, well, here, the thing is...
But it could be, it also is that there are some abuses in the system. There's plenty of room for reform in the workman's comp system.
See, here's what people say, without a causation, somebody had an injury that's 90% attributable to what happened 10 years ago, unrelated to a recent injury in the plant or so forth. The full cost of dealing with that is allocated to the current employer.
Yeah, well,
or if the person is out there playing Frisbee with his kids on a Sunday, and Monday walks in and says, here, I got this injury, that's covered as well.
But the way
you would agree that's probably not ideal. I understand you wanted to get it away from long, protracted
Yes.
legal battles, but you don't want to have people abusing the
No,
system.
I would personally, I can't speak for my organization, we don't get into this
Okay.
issue, but personally, I believe that a system where you allocate based on percentages, a pure comparative fault system, would be the way to go. So that
Okay.
if only 10% is attributable to the job or to the
Enough
armor
said.
service.
Rauner's okay, I'm sure that's a causation standard. That's one I'm sure he could live with. Okay, I'm sure Speaker Mike would understand that. He's practiced law himself for
Yes.
3 or 4 decades. Okay, so sure he'd give him that. And the property tax freeze. So Rauner wants the vote on term limits and redistricting. He wants workman's comp reform. He wants a property tax freeze, which he's working out with Cullerton and Madigan.
I'm not sure property tax freeze, okay, so.
And I think if he gets that, I think he'll say, okay, Democrats, you want more revenue? I'll modernize the sales tax. That means extending the sales tax in Illinois to include services. That's the $700 million new revenue right there. You know, if we fix up workman's comp, we probably bring in more companies that will generate probably within a year or two another $500 million there. So that's $1.2 billion in new revenue. I'll be reasonable with you on the cuts in spending. They still may be disputing whether they have to have an increase in the income tax rate, but if they didn't, I think Rauner says that's enough. I don't need to go to right to work this year in terms of those zones. I think he would take that deal. I think Madigan and Cullerton might take that deal. Do you agree?
I agree. I think that's a doable deal. I would add my own personal opinion here, again, not my organization's, but my personal opinion is we will not get out from under these continuing crises unless and until we actually address the underlying cause of most of these problems, which is a structural deficit in the state's budget. For years, we have been borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. We have been incurring debt for operating expenses, which we should not be doing, because we won't address the basic disparity that exists between the amount of revenue that's generated by our taxing systems and the amount that the state needs to spend to provide appropriate services through the state and local governments.
Well, you know, the response from Rauner and other Republicans who tend to focus on economic growth and think there's a correlation between lower tax rates and economic growth would say you cannot tax your way out of this. And so they're willing to give you some increase, not in the tax rate, but at least tax base that generates more revenue. They're willing to make an argument that you'll get more tax revenue as you get more economic growth from some of the things we just discussed. And they would say, you know, we had, in a sense, an increase in the tax rate because we went from 3% to 5% 4 years ago. And then we rolled it back, but not completely. So now the income tax rate went this year, 2015, from 5% to 3.75. So over the last 4 years, we've gone up. We've gone up, and that's about $2 billion more in revenue than we would have had if we stayed at a 3% rate. So they would say, we've in a sense compromised, we being the Republicans. I'm not me, I'm balanced. But they would say the Republicans have compromised, Democrats have compromised, you're somewhere between 3 and 5. And now you can haggle us to be closer. I know you want to go up to something like 5.5. And they would say that's going to really damage growth a lot. That's why so that's almost for another day.
That is for another day.
Although
but I
Rauner would say, you know, there was a referendum in a sense on this issue in 2014 when he was elected, because you had Quinn running for re-election on this high. Give him that. He wasn't saying he would. He said, I raise taxes, I want to keep them there, and that's his position. And voters, if they wanted to re-elect Quinn, if they wanted higher taxes, they could have gone with Quinn. Rauner was talking rollback, and they went with Rauner 50 to 46. So what do you say to that? Then
there were many issues in the governor's race, Jeff, that went far beyond that. If Rauner wants to put on a referendum whether we should go to, say, a tax system, I would say it's not only a matter of rates, it's also a matter of the fairness of the system. So if we really want to reform the entire system to improve things, to eliminate the structural deficit, get enough revenue in to actually pay for what the state needs to provide in the way of services, then we should also consider going to a progressive income tax, and I'd be happy to see that put to a vote, put to a referendum to the voters as to whether to change to a progressive income system.
Yeah, you know, I mean, they've sort of tried that in Maryland. It hasn't really worked wonders. I think it's in Connecticut they have a progressive tax, not real wonders. New Jersey raised taxes.
By itself, it doesn't work wonders, but it does increase the fairness of the system.
Well, but fairness is one thing. If you end up with fewer jobs and you have people more
It doesn't-
unemployed, that's not fair.
If you're talking about raising the same amount of money as you would under a flat tax system, it's simply a question of taking a little more from richer people and a little less from poorer people.
But, you know, paraphrasing what somebody said recently, one of the candidates running, I think it was Rand Paul, you know, he's never had a job working for a poor person. So you can try to tax the rich as much as you want, but it's the rich, it's the entrepreneurs, it's the people who are the higher income levels that tend to produce jobs.
I would have to disagree fundamentally with you, Jeff. I think that the people who do most of the working and living and dying in this country are entitled to roughly the same standard of living as everybody else.
I'm not saying entitled, I'm saying in the free market, the people who provide the jobs, who produce the jobs, tend to be on the higher income level. Some would say because they take the risk. They give up a
I know
for
they
sure
say that.
salary.
I know they say that, but that's
You
a
understand free markets.
I understand free
You
markets,
you
but
saw
Jeff,
this book
that's a
like Milton
that's a
Friedman, Milton
fallacy.
Friedman, Capitalism?
That's a
Have you ever
fallacy.
read this, David?
I have read that. It's a fallacy.
Milton was wrong?
No, here's what's the fallacy. The fallacy is that economic growth comes from a few people creating lots of jobs. The truth of the matter is, human progress is slow. We work through trial and error. We learn a lot through mistakes. We improve through mistakes. Our workforce and our economy has gotten much more productive over the last century. That's mostly due to the efforts of the people who are actually doing the work.
As opposed to the person who was the entrepreneur who built the
There's
company?
somebody who has an idea. Making the idea work is just as important or more important, and that's done by great masses
Okay.
of people, not by someone who just has an idea.
Okay, I don't want to get too sidetracked on that because I want to get to what's very current. As I say, we're taping this on the 7th.
We are.
And just yesterday, the Rauner came out and he sort of proposed a deal. He said, in a press conference on August 6th, he said, look, I'm trying to work with folks. I'm trying to work with the city. I'm here as governor of the state. And he says, it's a two-way street. He says, never really has the city come to him, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and said, here's what I want. And he just like flat out refused. He'll certainly listen. He'll try to work with these folks to do things. But he says, you have to work in terms, get away from the idea that Chicago just gets something. You have a fair amount of power, Mayor Rahm Emanuel. You control, in a sense, a lot of state reps. Cullerton and Madigan control a lot of state reps out and state senators outside of Chicago. Chicago has a lot of power. I'm paraphrasing, the governor said. So they need to work with him so he can have some of these other reforms we've said, and they can get some of what he wants. So he said, look, he's prepared. He's told there was a $600 million pension payment that was due, one another will be due. He said, we'll work with the city to delay that. We'll pick up some of the pension costs of the CPS for the next 2 years. They're, I don't know, normal pension costs, I think they call them. We'll give them, you know, they want to, in a sense, they can't collectively bargain to get the teachers to pay half of what they're paying for pensions. You know, teachers used to pay 30 years ago 9% of their salary in Chicago. And they got a deal where they only paid 2%. The CPS picks up 7% of the employee share and then picks up 9% of the employer share.
Yes.
So they said, well, pass a law if that's what you want, that Chicago teachers will have to pay that extra 7%. And he says, you know, but what we're doing there is we're showing you guys can't control your costs because we are collectively bargaining. You want the state to push a law that does this. Well, let's have a law for everybody that says if the local government unit wants to take collective bargaining on wages and pensions out of the hands sort of the union and their employer, makes it as it used to be, like a civil service job, here's what you get. There was a day when we actually had that. You're a young guy, David, since you would remember, but I remember. Okay.
Jeff, I'm actually a little older than
Okay,
you are.
but anyway, so seriously, and he says, so I've outlined what he said, and he says, and he says, and you can keep your $500 million or $600 million block grants. So is that fair, what he's just proposed?
Is that fair? I think that it's not a question of whether I think it's fair. My organization,
think the
I
mayor
can't speak for the organization, but I do know that the mayor was on TV
Yeah.
last night saying,
Chicago
I'm willing to
Tonight,
sit down.
WTTW, who was he, who was interviewed, who was?
Paris Schutz was interviewing
My
him, he
good
did a
friend
good
Paris
job.
Schutz, he's a good guy, yeah.
The mayor said, look, I'm open to discussing and negotiating anything, but it has to be discussed, and it has to be discussed to a certain extent. You have to build a level of trust between the governor and the legislative leaders and the mayor, everyone who's involved in the negotiating process. I think that's probably true.
There's a deal that Rauner asked for yesterday that I repeated here. I know you're not speaking for the organization, but speaking for David Melton, does that sound like that's the core of a deal that can be negotiated?
I think there are elements there that could be the core of a deal that could be negotiated. I would tweak it some if I were negotiating on the other side, and I think that would be fair and would make it actually fairer. But no, look, if we want to treat Chicago, after all, is the place where half, if not more than half, of the people in this state live, and where half the kids are. So the people in Chicago have a strong interest in seeing that they're treated fairly.
We've covered much of, but not all of the so-called turnaround agenda reforms. Let me just mention quickly, there has to be some pension reform. That's the topic of a whole nother show, because we're in a situation where the state Supreme Court has essentially said you can't do anything.
No,
you
the
can't
state Supreme
modify.
Court has not said that. The Constitution
Well, they
says
said
that.
the Constitution says that, but you and I know the Attorney General has argued there are police powers in the Constitution would allow them to do what
And you and
what
I
they
also
want.
know that's an extremely weak argument legally.
There's nothing I love the Attorney General. Lisa Manning, would you come on the show? But seriously, there's nothing, she would not take a position that's extremely weak.
She
and just
took a
have it
position
done.
that she did not have any choice. She was left with.
Okay. But the point is, we can argue about that, but something has to be done, and it's a quandary, because people don't know if you're saying nothing can be done to reform pensions.
No, something can be done to reform pensions. What should have been done from the beginning. This state, since 1915, has failed to adequately fund its pension obligations. The problem grew astronomically
Okay.
worse over the last 30 years.
Some of it may be funding, but some of
No,
them
actually,
is
the
that,
biggest cause,
Okay.
the studies show that by far the majority of the problem is caused by the state failing to properly fund
There
the
are
system,
people-
not by excessive costs.
I
in
know
the
that's a
system.
position, but there are people, Center for Tax and Budget Accountability would agree with you on that. The Illinois Policy Institute would not. They say the pensions in Illinois in the public sector are above what they are in the private sector, so that has to be
That's
reformed.
exactly right, and I would urge people to go look at the numbers and see
Okay.
who they think is right.
That's fine, but my point is that's a whole nother issue that he wants reformed that may be out of his
We
hands
certainly
because
need
of the
to-
court.
We certainly need to address the pension issue.
Okay. And there's all this issue about prevailing wages. I think that shows that local school districts, local government units pay more than they should because they're paying above market wages. Others would argue those are union wages and they should be, but you also have things like project labor agreements like John McCarran has written, and he's no right-winger. Those are outrageous costs, like $45 an hour. You would agree.
There's room for negotiation
Those
there.
things, so, and the right to work, last thing, the right to work issue does have to be addressed. Rauner says he doesn't want to make the Illinois a right to work state, but give local
Yes, he
governments
does.
that.
He wants to, but he doesn't, but he wants
Let
to
me
go about
finish.
it piecemeal.
That he wants to give those local governments the power to do that, because then people in Rockford could decide if they want to be right to work and they could get more jobs, or in Decatur, many of the depressed areas of the state, they as a government and as a people may be willing to make that trade-off, and if so, paraphrasing the Pope, who am I to say differently, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So if that's what they want, that's what he's saying, allow them to do that, and then you solve some of the, this is where you and Rauner come together, because you said there's a structural revenue problem. He would say, no, there's a structural problem in how government operates to inflate the costs. If you can deflate the costs, then you don't have to inflate your tax rates and revenue. And with that,
Thank you, Jeff.
all right, and you
Thank
come
you for
back.
having me.
And just everybody's watching this show, I hope. You just keep watching every week. Come back next week and every week to Public Affairs.